Are you communicating your message effectively and respectfully?
I love bookkeeping.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for listening to the I Love Bookkeeping podcast. My name is Hannah Robinson.
And I'm Melissa Honan.
Today, we're going to be talking about something that you can use with pretty much any aspect of your life, and that is how to effectively communicate. Melissa, I feel like we touch on this in almost every single episode, but today we're really taking a deep dive into it. Arguably one of our favorite topics, I feel like.
Yes, I think primarily because I have been working with a communication consultant for almost 2 years. So it's always at the front of my mind. It's just like a floating gen head, like that's going through my brain. Anytime I talk to somebody is like, what would Jen say? And that's kind of how I base my thoughts on communication, is just like, what would Jen say? Because to me, she's like my Yoda.
That's amazing. And I didn't even know that there was communication consultants for something like that.
There isn't. She quit. She
oh,
stopped.
Man.
Yeah. So she isn't really a communication consultant anymore. She's been my communications consultant and business coach. But she actually closed down the biggest part of her business because she went into working in her passion field in the political sphere of things, which is terrifying to me.
Very.
Consulting with different like political groups on how to effectively communicate and respect people's boundaries. And so she's doing the good work. But there are other communication consultants. It typically is going to be like a business coach that specializes in communicating. And so you can find them. And I highly recommend it because, it's really like therapy where you're never really done. You're never really like healed. Like, oh yeah, I'm healed, right? No, you're constantly healing. So you've never like fully mastered the art of communication. You're working on communicating effectively, and we all have room for improvement. So that's my biggest tip, is that obviously you can't really, I guess maybe you can communicate by yourself. You're typically communicating with other people. And the best way, I think, to get better at that is to practice.
I totally agree, especially with what you said about therapy and, you're never totally healed. I think when it comes to communication, there's always something to be gained and always something to learn about. So when I knew we were going to do this episode, I looked into some effective ways for communication and did some research, as I do with every episode. But I came across the 4 main types of communication. And I'm going to go over those, touch on those really quick before we take a dive in to some great ways to communicate, especially when it comes to owning a business. But the first one is verbal, which is obviously speaking to somebody. I feel like that's very self-explanatory. I don't need to dive into that anymore. The second one is nonverbal, which is your body language, your facial expressions, making eye contact, all that non-speaking, kind of the energy you put out. The third one is written, which is writing messages, notes, emails, anything that you can write, really. And the fourth one is visual, which is presentations, graphs, models, images, things of that nature. So I really enjoyed reading about the 4 different types of communication because it's so true that there really are just 4 main aspects of it that I never really thought about, and that different situations call for different kinds of communications. And I think it's super important to identify what form of communication really needs to take precedence for different issues.
That's so true. And thinking about it that way too, because I'm all about like compartmentalization. I'm, trying to think of, okay, well, say for instance, you're giving a presentation, you're going to be using all 4 of those, right? And so naturally you would want to practice to make sure that all 4 of those are operating fluidly together. And I know what I struggle with is nonverbal? Because I have a natural resting bitch face and definitely an active one. And so even if I could get my, verbal message down to be appropriate, a lot of times I have a really hard time masking that. I don't know about you.
I completely agree with you. I was going to say my weak point is nonverbal because I get such resting bitch face. And another thing that I really struggle with is hiding my facial expressions and being neutral. I try so hard not to roll my eyes in situations. And I know that's really messed up, but it's my first thing I want to do is like, look at somebody like, are you crazy? Like, just like the look on your face where it's just like, I mean, I have a million like gifs in my head that are going off right now, but I'm terrible at hiding facial expressions. So that's definitely my hardest, my biggest, the form of communication that I struggle with the most and I have the hardest time with. I think my best one is probably verbal or written. That's probably what I'm best at. Probably better. I think I'm pretty decent verbally, but I think I'm even better. I think I'm better at writing.
I can speak English if that's what you're asking. I definitely excel at written, but verbal is actually, and a lot of people, I've been getting feedback from the podcast that I apparently present very confident and well-spoken. And I want you guys to know it's a farce. And it's all editing. I struggle with verbal communication so bad because I don't think it is hard. I struggle trying to balance all of these different things. I really excel, I think, in written communication, not necessarily that I am this amazing writer that has all of this beautiful language and big words, but that I feel that I can communicate effectively. And so I think that's a big difference I want to put in this is that we're not saying that to master verbal communication, you have to be this, immaculate, presenter on stage, or that, for written communication, you are the next Shakespeare. It's just that, are you communicating your message effectively and respectfully? I think at least that is my goal when I'm communicating, is just how to do it effectively so that they understand what I'm saying and I am doing it in a respectful manner.
And I think that is a great segue into my next point, which is when communicating, I think no matter the form of communication that you're using, I think professionalism is really key here. And by being professional, I think there's no reason, especially when we're talking about owning a business, whether you are the business owner or you're an employee or you're the boss, or I think no matter what, it costs $0 to not be an asshole. And there's no need to ever be hostile or snarky with people that you have to communicate with every day.
Despite the overwhelming urge that you will have.
Because the thing is, you have to work with these people. You have to work alongside people that you're going to butt heads with or don't necessarily see eye to eye. And I think maintaining professionalism and working together to solve something really can help with a lot of conflict in the workplace. And when I say professionalism is key, with verbal, I think, there's no reason to ever raise your voice. There's no reason to ever use abusive language. I feel like that should be a given, but apparently it's not. With nonverbal, it's professionalism and nonverbal, just like we talked about, is something that even I have to work on, is just maintaining not my resting bitch face and having a neutral look on my face when in meetings or when maybe hearing something that you don't necessarily agree with. I think that's what I definitely struggle with the most when it comes to professionalism. But, when it comes to written communication, overlook your emails, double check them, make sure you spelled everything right, make sure you got the right name. And same.
Ooh, I have a plug. This is not a sponsor, but
what's the plug?
That is a great, there we go. If you have not heard of it yet, it is called Grammarly.
Oh, yeah.
Grammarly. Okay. Y'all, we do not expect you to, again, you don't have to be the next Shakespeare. You don't have to be, perfect when it comes to the grammar because you've got tools, y'all. And go ahead and install Grammarly on your computer right now. They do have a free version, but I use this for almost everything. It automatically checks my emails, it checks my Slack messages, it checks whatever document that I'm working on that's going to be client facing. And it can do, as easy as just checking to make sure you spelled everything correctly, but they'll make recommendations if you're not wording things in the best light. I also love it for when I'm writing blog posts because there is a plagiarism checker on the I think it's on the purchase one. I think I have the premium subscription. But just in case, if I have somebody writing something for me, I will run it through that plagiarism filter and just make sure that nothing accidentally got pulled from something exactly that way. So again, I think when it comes to communicating effectively, you're not on your own and you don't have to learn these things. There's tons of tools to help you.
I think there's so many tools at our disposal that we can use to better communicate with our coworkers, our loved ones, our bosses. I think one of those, kind of like Grammarly, what you were talking about, I think we have so many, that's the beauty of tech, I think, is one of the things that there's so many different apps and different platforms and softwares that you can use to communicate. What I know as a business owner yourself, what are some ways that you like for your employees to communicate with you if you are delegating something?
I don't think I understand. Can you repeat that?
So let's say you are delegating a task or talking about an issue within the company. If you have an employee that has questions or needs clarification or disagrees even, what are some ways that you feel like you best communicate with your employees?
Okay. So I think personally, I will typically use Slack for communication. But if I were to delegate something to an employee, I would actually prefer that they use whatever method they need to best understand so that they have what they need, if that makes sense. So for me, I prefer Slack. I don't want to be killed in meetings necessarily, but if you sitting down in a meeting with me while I explain the details of what I want done is going to be what gets you to understand, then I'm going to do that. So for me, from a boss perspective, I want to do whatever they need so that the expectations are clear, and I will modify my communication style appropriately. And I think that's a big thing being a boss in a sense, is that I see it as an educational opportunity. If somebody is not understanding what I'm saying to them, it is on me to modify my communication so that they do understand rather than the opposite. Now, I think that there is a lot of collaboration in that so that you guys understand each other. But I do think a big part of it is it's my responsibility to modify my communication to what they need.
Well, and I think a lot of miscommunication among the workplace can be avoided if people will just ask questions and kind of clarify. I know that sounds like, oh, that's duh, everyone should be doing that. But I think a lot of things kind of get lost in the shuffle, especially when you have big, employee-wide.
When you make assumptions.
Yeah, if assumptions are made or if you have an employee-wide meeting, that's when things kind of get miscommunicated. I think also another really important thing, and we could talk about this until we're blue in the face, but I think another really important thing in the workplace is to communicate not only your goals, but also your boundaries and expectations. Is that something that you do kind of right off the bat when you hire?
No. Yeah. So yes and no. Yes. Yes, no, and yes. Goals. Yes. Expectations. Yes. Boundaries. No. In a sense that, that is something I'm a work in progress, right? Will Smith said,
aren't we all? Aren't we all?
Aren't we all? He did.
What a pop culture reference. That is amazing.
What a pop culture reference. And, but it's true, right? In the sense that, because I'm still working on figuring out what my boundaries are as somebody that I'm not even the most people pleaser in a sense, but, through a combination of just like personal life where I personally struggle with boundaries, I've seen that seep into my work life. And so in a place where I feel like I've always succeeded in creating boundaries in work life, I'm realizing through the work I'm doing on my personal side that I have room for improvement. What I like to ask right from the beginning, though, is to figure out what my employees' goals and boundaries and expectations are. Because I think that's helping me learn is what other people's boundaries are. And at least letting them know that I care enough to consider their boundaries, because I think it's different for everybody. Even just saying, I have, back when my executive assistant first started, asking her questions about her personal life, I always let her know, like, hey, you don't have to answer this, but I was just wondering about your art. Because she's an artist. And, I had been told from some other employees on the team that she had a really cool Instagram where she posted a lot of her art on it. And so I made sure to reach out to her and I said, hey, I've heard a lot of really great things about your art and I really appreciate art. And I've worked with artists for a really long time. Would it be okay if I followed you on Instagram? You don't have to say, yes, I understand that we work together. And if that's something that you want to keep separate, like I will not be offended, but I wanted you to know that I would love to support your art if that's, not, if that's not going over the line. And she said it was perfectly fine. I think it was one of those things where I held off a while till I felt like I could ask her and I knew her well enough that she would honestly have told me no if she didn't feel comfortable. So I do think it's really important to ask other people what their boundaries are, as well as setting your own, because I think we're all learning and boundaries can also change and be fluid, depending on how long you work with somebody, and depending on what your working relationship is.
Today's show is brought to you by Keeper, the one app to run your bookkeeping business. Keeper helps you get faster client responses with your own custom branded QuickBooks integrated client portal. Finally, you can say goodbye to those pesky spreadsheets full of uncategorized transactions. Keeper also helps you catch those embarrassing coding errors before your clients do. And with Keeper, you can generate beautiful custom reports that your clients will absolutely love to read. To find out more, go to keeper.app. That's keeper.app. Mention I Love Bookkeeping to get 20% off your first 3 months. Again, go to keeper.app to find out more. Thank you for listening.
I think boundaries can kind of circle back to what we said about how your communication style and your communication, kind of the evolution of how you communicate, it's never ending. I think it's one of those things that's always changing, and it's something that you can always improve on and you always learn and you can never stop learning. And I think it's something really that a lot of workplaces need to be understanding, in the fact that everyone's boundaries are going to change as you go on. And I think that really creates for a happy work environment when it's an open space to evolve. And I feel like I'm sitting here thinking about anytime I've had a job interview or I've been a new hire, I think there's been maybe like once or twice where the person interviewing or hiring me asked me what my expectations were. Not that it's something that I feel like I'm entitled to, but I think that's a hallmark of a really good business owner and a really good boss to get kind of level with you and level with your employees and see what they want and what and what they're looking for in that position. And that kind of circles back to a recent episode that we just recorded about being a good boss and having a good work culture. But I think that really, that can really be a cherry on top of business ownership, is to really communicate effectively and have one-on-one good relationships with your employees from the get-go. I think that really starts things off on an encouraging and a positive note.
Yeah, I also think that's a great question to be like a check question to make sure that you're communicating the expectations effectively as well. Because if you've done your job when, the employee basically says, oh, well, my expectations of the job are this, and they're in line with the expectations you've set, okay, boom, we communicated effectively. But if they say that their expectations of the job are something totally left field, then you're like, oh shit, where did I go wrong? All right. And then that's when you need to ask more probing questions, just like, okay, how were those expectations set? Like, and then you can ask more probing questions. So I think that's a great check question to see if you guys are on the same page.
Yeah. Well, and I think if that's something that you haven't already implemented, a great thing that you can do as a company or as a boss is to schedule check-ins among your team in order to not only stay organized, but stay up to date with what's going on in their lives. And again, it's not that you have to probe for personal questions, but you can stay up to date with their expectations and their goals. And I think that's such an important part of communication, is to nurture the relationship that you have within your workplace. And I think another really important thing to do that kind of goes hand in hand with scheduling those check-ins among your team is to confront any issues ASAP and in a calm manner in order to resolve things quickly. I think there's nothing worse than when there's tension built and nobody's doing anything about it, and everyone's just kind of sitting back waiting for the explosion to happen. And I think dealing with issues head on is really a great way to communicate and have your expectations and goals really clear.
It's so funny that you said that, because a lot of us work remotely, right? We're building these remote bookkeeping environments. So like, how would that tension build? Oh my gosh, it can build virtually. And what's so funny about that is, especially if you have like intuitive people on your team, which I do, they feel it even when they're not involved in it. It's so weird. And so just keeping an eye on that and really confronting it quickly. Again, we're not perfect. We're still a work in progress. There are going to be issues and conflicts, but addressing it and then being open and transparent with those involved as to what you're doing specifically to resolve it. And I will not go into details about that right now, but I will say I am going through something very similar right now in our company. And that was really my saving grace. And a lot of the feedback I got from the team was, thank you so much for telling us what is going on and what steps you're making to improve. And so that's just, I think it's really important to differentiate that. Yes, conflict does happen, remotely, virtually. It will still be felt by the intuitive team members of your team. And the really important part of that is exactly what you said, like confront those issues as quickly as possible, but and be as transparent as possible as to how you are going to resolve them. So true, Hannah.
Well, and I think that also, dealing with things head on can really translate to personal relationships too, because I think it becomes resentful almost if there's an issue, and instead of confronting it or communicating it head on, then head on doesn't have to be aggressive. I think head on is just nipping it in the bud before it snowballs. That's something that I have struggled with, is not dealing with things as they come and letting it snowball until it kind of implodes. And I think a lot of people can relate to that.
I think every person in the world can relate to that, and not to get like too into like the personal relationship aspect of it. But I do also think that this is true for all relationships, but I don't know if you've heard of Dr. John Gottman's The Four Horsemen.
Yes, the Four Horsemen.
Okay, so as soon as you say resentment, that's exactly like where I go to. And so for those of you that don't know, basically John Gottman did, I think it was what is it called? Like a study. Yeah, like a study on basically like why do marriages end? And it's so funny because this is something like Daniel was so obsessed with, like when we first got married, because he was like, oh, we got to think about it ahead of time. And then he never like talked about it again. But anyway, just like a little bit too much into my personal life. Anyway, there are four horsemen essentially. And in his study, these are the things that he identified as like that marriage is going to end. And it's criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. And a lot of that comes from like resentment, essentially. And I think that all four of these things are also really important and can happen in any relationship outside of just your marriage. And so, I highly recommend everybody look into them. And there are a lot of like anecdotes to the Four Horsemen. Like, again, we're talking about tools that you can use to improve your communication. I highly recommend looking into the anecdotes to the Four Horsemen and how you can improve your communication if you find that you are experiencing these things, because it's not too late. And a lot of people like, and even some of the studies say like, oh, once you get to this point, your marriage is going to end. It's not necessarily true, because there are a lot of things that you can actively work on to improve your marriage. Same with communicating with employees, communicating in a workplace. You can get to a point where you're like, oh my God, I hate that guy. But there are actually tools that you can put in place to try to work yourself out of that role, out of that mindset, and into a place where you guys can actually work together harmoniously. And I have done that before. Again, I'm all about the anecdotes. Anecdotal evidence is not the only thing you should be looking for. You should be looking for facts. For facts, go look at the John Gottman. For anecdotes, I will tell you, I have gotten to that place in those toxic work environments where I hated a person. That person hated me. It was fueled by that bad manager I mentioned in another episode. And we addressed it head on one day and realized that we were just being swindled on both ends. And we talked about all of the issues that we had each other in a calm, respectful manner. And we discussed ways that we could rebuild the trust with one another and start to work together. It's not easy, but it can be that easy, right? That direct communication where you say, this is a problem. I want to solve it. How can I solve it for you? How can you solve it for me, and work together? So it's never too late to implement these ways to communicate effectively, essentially, is the gist of that.
Well, and I think that's so important for the work environment, because essentially your employees or your coworkers are people that you should be working together toward a common goal. And so I think it's really unfortunate when you're in a workplace where there are the four horsemen of divorce, even though we're talking about a workplace. And to circle back to a workplace that I had that we talked about in a previous episode, I had a boss who pretty much used all four of those, the four horsemen. And it's interesting when you are dealing with someone who is not interested in evolving or growing. I think that is one of those rare instances where it's time to bow out and say, this is not for me. But the way that I was able to effectively communicate that was to go to the head honcho above that person and say, this is my boundary. I will not tolerate being spoken to like this. This is disrespectful. And I'm either going to find a new job or a new position. And I think that was kind of one of the first times in my early 20s where I really stood up for myself and communicated my boundaries, because it was just such a position of abuse that I just wasn't willing to go through it anymore. I just thought no one should cry on their lunch break. Nobody should be that miserable. But it will give you a sense of confidence to stand up for yourself and to communicate that in a respectful manner. I think both things can be done. I think you can stand up for yourself and you cannot tolerate disrespect, but you can also do it in a respectful manner and put yourself above the person who is disrespecting you so heavily. And the outcome of that situation was that I did get to change positions. I didn't have to find a new job. I did get to change positions in this workplace. But that never would have happened if I wouldn't have asked.
That is such a big thing is just really like determining what you need and then asking those around you to respect that and to help you with what you need is just so important. And sometimes it does take those essentially trauma, right? To like determine what you need because you realize, whew, I don't need this. And so I think it's definitely learning in a remote environment, assuming that you're starting your own company, you're not a toxic boss, there aren't toxic people. I think a way to counteract and fight to make sure these things don't happen is to always operate under the assumption of positivity and assume the best intention in those that you work with. One thing that we're trying to do right now, like on our management team, is to overly communicate positively in a sense that, again, we're already going to assume that everyone is on the same team, that we're operating towards the same goal, that we all have each other's best interests in mind. And then when we're communicating, writing items in Slack specifically, we're trying to be overly positive in that messaging, because the one thing with all of these tools and all of these recommendations that we've made on it communicating effectively, you have to put them on steroids when it comes to working remotely, because you're going to lose a lot of the things. You're going to lose a lot of that. If you're not talking to someone verbally, if they don't see your nonverbal because they don't see your body language or your facial expressions, you're not making eye contact. If you don't have the visual representation and you're really just operating via Slack message, which a lot of us do, then you need to, make accommodations to make up for all of the other communication that you don't have to back up your messaging and really dial up the positivity so that you're accurately, getting your message across. So I think that's a big thing in a remote environment, is finding a way to communicate when you don't have all of the other communication methods kind of backing up. If you can't smile while you're saying your message, right? Make sure you put a smiley face on the end. I know it sounds silly, but that'll go a long way for a lot of people, especially people with anxiety, who will automatically assume that you're mad at them no matter what you're sending to them. Throw a smiley face at the end.
Yeah. And I think that is a great way to end this segment on communication, is just creating a positive atmosphere for yourself and your coworkers and your employees. I think it makes such a giant difference if you positively communicate with people and just, add an exclamation point. That's a hard word. Add a smiley face. It sounds so frivolous, but it goes a long way to give people a positive experience with you.
It does a lot. And I know I've struggled at doing that for other people, and it's something that I'm working on. I will say another one of my recommendations for content is, and I don't know the name of it, so y'all are going to have to fact check this, look this up, whatever. There is this woman on TikTok, and maybe you've seen her, Hannah, that she basically translates things you want to say, but into corporate lingo. And it's like her talking to her friend, and she's like, so, what would I say if I wanted to say this? And then he translates it into what you would say professionally. As silly as that seems, it is so effective for repositioning your mind. And it's also just funny content. So I highly recommend looking at that, and really just at the end of the day, Google. If you're having a hard time and you're like, man, I feel like I'm just not getting this thing done, dude, just Google, how can I be more positive on Slack? Google is always your friend, especially as a bookkeeper, just so you know, we all just Google things. Okay. Fun fact, I know what I'm doing, and I also use Google for everything. So, just know that you're not alone, and that you have the entire internet to support you, and also us too.
If you guys have special ways that you like to communicate with your employees, your coworkers, your boss, or you are the boss, shoot us an email. We always love to hear from you guys. You can send us a message at success@ilovebookkeeping.com. Again, that is success@ilovebookkeeping.com. My name is Hannah Robinson.
And I'm Melissa Honan.
And thank you for listening to the I Love Bookkeeping podcast.
I love bookkeeping. Here's a little shout to all my friends working hard at keeping the books. You want to change your life, you want to grow that biz, it's not as hard as it looks. Be a money guide, a profit coach, step up your game